I have been asked more than once to tell this story. Asked by younger men who want to understand how it all began, how a noble house fell in a single night, how a boy walked into a desert and came out something else entirely, and how people that the galaxy had written off as primitives eventually made the most powerful military force in human history bleed out into the sand. I have been reluctant, not because the memory hurts, though it does. I have carried worse. I am reluctant because the truth of it is not clean. It is not a story of heroes doing heroic things in a straight line toward victory. It is a story about what humans do when everything has already been taken from them. It is a story about the cost of that. But I will tell it once plainly, and I will not dress it up. My name is Gurney Halleck. I was weapons master and first blade to House Atreides. I served Duke Leto for 22 years, longer than some of his soldiers had been alive. I taught his son to fight. I stood at his right hand when he addressed his men, and I slept near enough to his chambers to reach them in 8 seconds if the alarm sounded. 22 years of that, and I was not there when it mattered most. That is the thing I carry. You want to understand what happened on Arrakis, you have to understand what Arrakis was before we arrived. It was not a planet in any comfortable sense of the word. It was a wound in space, a place so hostile to organic life that every creature on its surface had spent millions of years becoming something sharp and durable and pitiless. The desert there did not suffer waste. What could not endure died. What endured changed. And what changed sufficiently became something that the rest of the galaxy could barely comprehend. The resource that made it worth dying over was a compound the scientists called a geriatric spice, a substance produced nowhere else in the known universe, extracted from beneath those endless orange dunes by enormous crawler machines that chewed through the rock and sand like slow steel beetles. Without this spice, interstellar navigation became unreliable, and reliable navigation was the skeleton of the entire galactic economy. Whoever controlled the spice controlled the shipping lanes. Whoever controlled the shipping lanes controlled commerce. Whoever controlled commerce controlled armies, and armies controlled everything else. So the planet mattered. It mattered enormously, and the people who had lived on it for generations, who had adapted to its brutal conditions in ways that outsiders could not fully measure, those people mattered not at all to the powers that squabbled over the spice. They were obstacles at best. At worst, they were a resource to be managed. They had been occupied, marginalized, pushed into the deep desert, and systematically denied the technology that might have let them push back. The ruling noble house that had controlled the extraction operations for decades had treated them accordingly, with the casual cruelty of people who do not consider themselves cruel, who simply consider themselves practical. That house had been removed from the planet by imperial decree. Their replacement was us. Duke Leto understood the trap the moment the order arrived. I saw it on his face, the same expression he wore when a sparring partner telegraphed a lunge. He understood it completely and chose to walk into it anyway, because the alternative was to appear weak before the imperial court, and weakness in that environment had consequences of its own. He was not a naive man. He was a man who looked at the board, calculated the odds, accepted them, and played. He told me the night before we left our homeworld that he believed an alliance with the native desert people was the only genuine path forward, not as subject populations, as partners. The previous occupiers had spent decades trying to eliminate their resistance. Leto wanted to do the opposite, to earn their trust, to harness what they knew about the desert, to build something that could actually hold. He was, as I said, not a naive man. He knew that trust between the newcomers and the people who had every reason to hate newcomers was not built in a month, or a season, or perhaps even a year. He was prepared to be patient. He did not have time to be patient. The planet received us with the appropriate hostility. The heat was a physical force, not warmth, not discomfort, but assault. The light was white and flat and unforgiving. The sand got into everything. The joints of equipment, the mechanics of weapons, the spaces between your back teeth. Men who had trained in arid climates struggled within the first week. The locals watched from a distance, or did not appear at all, their presence announced only by the occasional blue gleam of an eye at the edge of a shadow before it vanished. I made my assessment of the situation early and wrote it in a report the Duke received and acknowledged without comment. We were a garrison force operating in terrain that actively opposed us, in the middle of a native population that had been given every reason to regard us as the latest in a long line of exploiters, dependent on extraction infrastructure that any competent saboteur could compromise, and that was practically impossible to fully protect at scale. On paper, our position was untenable. The Duke knew this. His answer was not to improve the paper position but to change the fundamental relationship with the people on whose territory we were guests, whether they had invited us or not. That was the gamble. It was also, I have come to believe, the only sane play available. Paul, the Duke's son, he took to it differently than the rest of us. He had been having visions, dreams. His mother, Lady Jessica, had trained him in the mental disciplines of her sisterhood, and somewhere in the intersection of that training and whatever the desert was doing to his mind, he was seeing things before they happened. Not clearly, not reliably, but enough that I noticed the way he would sometimes pause mid-sentence, looking at nothing, his eyes going somewhere else, and then come back and be quieter than he had been before. I pushed him hard in those early weeks, maybe harder than I needed to. I told myself it was preparation, that he needed to be ready for what was coming, that the softness his homeworld had permitted him could get him killed here. That was true, but there was something else underneath it, something I only recognized later. I was afraid for him. He was 17. He had his father's jaw and his mother's eyes, and the kind of steady intelligence that makes you forget, momentarily, that the person possessing it is still mostly a boy. I pushed him because pushing was what I knew how to do. Love, for people like me, expresses itself through the making ready. In one of our sparring sessions, about 2 weeks into the posting, I came at him with a combination I had designed to teach him about overcommitment, a high attack that was a feint, the real threat coming low on the recovery. He had seen it once before, and I expected him to fall for it again because almost everyone fell for it twice. He didn't fall for it. He redirected the high feint with less motion than should have been possible, pivoted slightly, and put his practice blade against my ribs before I had completed the low attack. I stepped back and looked at him. He shrugged and said he had been thinking about the sequence. I told him thinking wasn't enough to do what he had just done. He said he had also been dreaming about it. I didn't know what to do with that information, so I reset and went at him again, harder. He got better, faster than I expected. He had always been technically proficient. Lady Jessica had seen to that. But technical proficiency and the willingness to actually hurt someone are different things, and the desert was clarifying his willingness at a rate that should have given me pause if I had not been so preoccupied with everything else. The first contact with the local Fremen fighters was not what I had anticipated. I had expected wariness. I had expected tests. I had not expected the particular quality of stillness they carried, or the way their eyes moved, constantly, cataloging exits and threats with the calm automation of people who have spent their entire lives in an environment that punishes inattention with death. They were not primitive. They were not unsophisticated. They were something the rest of humanity had mostly forgotten how to be, perfectly adapted. Every piece of excess trimmed away by 10,000 years of a desert that would kill you for wasting water, including the water that leaked from your eyes. Their fighters moved without sound. They communicated in gestures and breath. Their bladed weapons were made from the teeth of the great sandworms, creatures the size of city blocks that patrolled the deep desert with the mindless hunger of a geological force, drawn to vibration, consuming everything in their path. A tooth from one of those creatures, properly edged, held a molecular sharpness that no manufactured blade could match. It was the kind of detail that told you everything about these people, that they had looked at the most lethal thing on a lethal planet and said, "We can use that." I began spending evenings studying their language. I had a facility for languages. It was something the Duke had valued in me before the soldiering skills became what he valued most. But this language resisted me in ways I was not accustomed to. It was not just the sounds, which were difficult enough, consonant clusters that required a reconfiguration of how I used the back of my throat, vowels that shifted meaning based on subtle duration changes that my ear was not yet calibrated for. It was the logic underneath the words. The Fremen language had 17 distinct words for sand conditions. It had no word for wasted opportunity because the concept did not exist in their framework. If you had an opportunity and did not take it, you were not someone who had wasted an opportunity. You were someone who had revealed your own inadequacy, and that was a different and less forgiving categorization. The language told you something fundamental about the minds it had been built inside. I kept at it, an hour every evening too when I could manage. I told myself it was tactical, that the ability to communicate directly without a translator would matter when situations evolved too fast for translation. That was true. It was also, I admitted to myself only much later, that I was trying to understand what the Duke understood, trying to see what he had seen in this place that had made him willing to walk into the trap. We were still in the early weeks of that slow building trust when the hammer fell. It came at night, as ambushes do. It came through a traitor, as betrayals do. A man we had trusted, a physician who had served the house faithfully for years, who had been compromised in ways I did not know until too late, who carried his guilt like a stone in his chest the whole time. He disabled our defenses from the inside. The shielding systems that should have made the city impregnable simply stopped. And into that darkness came the attacking forces. The alarm found me in the outer compound, running a security rotation inspection. I was 3 minutes from the Duke's position when the first explosions went. I went toward them, not away, which is what you do when you have sworn an oath and have not yet understood that the oath is already past the point of keeping. I fought through 4 separate defensive positions. I put down 7 men, maybe 8. The number is imprecise in my memory because in that kind of engagement, in the dark and the confusion, counting is a luxury you cannot afford. I reached the corridor that would have taken me to the inner compound and found it collapsed and burning. I had been fighting for 11 minutes. I have thought about those 11 minutes often in the years since. What I could have done differently, whether 11 minutes, executed differently, could have changed the outcome. I have concluded, after long consideration, that it could not. The operation that destroyed House Atreides was not improvised. It had been planned with a precision that spoke of months of preparation, inside knowledge, and resources that we had not had the intelligence to anticipate. A weapons master arriving 3 minutes faster would not have altered the shape of what had been designed to be unalterable. I do not say this to absolve myself. I say it because it is accurate. The two things are separate. I had been fighting for 11 minutes when the nature of the enemy forces made itself fully clear to me. I had fought conventional soldiers before, good ones, disciplined ones. This was not that. The forces that poured through the breaches were a different category of problem. They had been raised, bred, trained, seasoned on a world of systematic suffering, a prison planet whose entire ecology had been engineered to produce human beings who were nothing but weapons. They had been fighting since they could walk. Pain was not a deterrent to them. It was a context they had lived in so long it had lost meaning. I put a blade through the forearm of one of them and watched him complete the attack he had already committed to, as if the wound was happening to someone else. He was not suppressing a pain response. He had, through years of the kind of conditioning I do not have language gentle enough to describe, simply moved the experience of physical damage outside the circle of things that affected his decision-making. Tactically, they were flawless movement patterns that adjusted in real time, an economy of violence that wasted nothing, a suppression of individual fear response that looked, from the outside, like something other than human. They were human, of course. That was the worst part in some ways. They were what humans become when a political structure decides that a population is expendable and worth optimizing for lethality. They were the product of centuries of deliberate brutalization, and they moved through the corridors of our city like a tide that did not care about the things tides break. I fought my way to the outer district and could not break back through. The sounds I heard were not sounds I will describe. Every man I reached either told me the inner positions had fallen or was already dead. By the time the pre-dawn light began to gray the horizon, I had 32 men around me and nowhere to go. The Duke was gone. That word gone was what the survivors used, and I accepted it because the alternative was to stop moving, and stopping meant dying, and dying at that moment meant the men around me died with me. So I kept moving. I filed the information away behind a wall I had built in my mind over many years of soldiering, a wall whose function was to allow me to continue functioning. I would take the wall down later. I took it down many times in many nights in the years that followed. But not then. We moved into the deep desert because there was nowhere else to go. The city was lost. The space above the planet was controlled by forces loyal to the Imperial Order and the house that had orchestrated the betrayal. There were no ships waiting for us. There was no rescue coming. There was the desert, and there was what we could carry, and there was the knowledge that the desert would kill us within days if we did not find the people who knew how to survive it. I will be honest with you. I did not expect to survive. I had 32 men and a dying hope and a desert that killed you for sweating wrong. What I was doing was not strategic. It was the continuation of motion because motion is what soldiers do when they have nothing left but motion. You keep moving because stopping is surrender, and surrender is a choice. And as long as you have not made that choice, you have not yet lost everything. The Fremen found us before the desert finished us. Or rather, they let us see them, which is not the same thing. They had been watching, certainly, long before they appeared. When they emerged from the rock formations at the edge of the deep erg, there were perhaps 40 of them, and they materialized out of the landscape so smoothly that 2 of my men actually raised their weapons before I signaled them down. Their leader looked at the remnant of House Atreides, 32 gaunt, sand-blasted, half-dead soldiers, and then looked at me. I did not grovel. I did not perform gratitude or desperation. I said, in the language of their people that I had spent the previous weeks memorizing with the determination of a man who understood the stakes, "We have lost everything. We ask only to walk with you." He studied me for a long time. Then he said something I only half understood, and his second-in-command translated. "The desert is not asked. The desert simply is. If you are still alive when we leave, you may follow." That was the beginning of what I can only describe as an education. The Fremen did not coddle their new companions. There was no period of adjustment, no allowance for the fact that we were not yet adapted to the environment. They moved at their pace and we either kept up or we did not. Hydration was governed by absolute discipline. They wasted no water ever, and expected the same from us immediately. The suits we had been given for desert operation were good technology, recycling the moisture from our bodies back into drinkable form, but they required adjustment and maintenance, and a kind of attentiveness to the body's systems that city-trained soldiers were not accustomed to. The Fremen taught us, but they taught us the way the desert taught, by letting the consequences of failure make the lesson. 3 men didn't make it through the first week, not killed by the enemy, killed by the desert by mistakes, by the gap between what they knew and what was required. The Fremen mourned the water they contained. That sounds brutal. It was not meant brutally. Water was the Fremen's most sacred resource, the thing their entire culture had organized itself around preserving and recovering and honoring. To mourn the water lost from a man's body was, in their framework, a form of respect. I found I could not argue with it. I found, in fact, that their framework had an internal coherence that made our frameworks look sentimental. I began to understand them slowly, the way you understand a piece of difficult terrain, not by looking at it from a distance, but by walking it in detail. Their combat doctrine was unlike anything I had trained against or for. It was built entirely around the specific conditions of the desert environment. The heat, the sand, the visibility patterns, the acoustic properties of rock formations, the behavior of the great worms when they sensed vibration. Every element of their fighting style took advantage of one environmental factor or another. They were ambush predators, not in a cowardly sense but in the most precise technical sense. They put themselves in positions where the environment did most of the work. The attacking forces that had destroyed House Atreides in the city, those forces with their flawless drill and their conditioned suppression of pain response, those forces had been designed for conventional warfare. Open ground, shields and projectiles, coordinated assaults on fixed positions. In the deep desert, none of that transferred. The tactics that made them nearly unstoppable in a city made them ponderous and predictable in the Urg. The Fremen had spent generations learning exactly how to fight an enemy who had more technology and more numbers and more institutional military training, and what they had learned was, don't fight that enemy. Fight the desert. I began to see, slowly, what Duke Leto had seen from the beginning. Not the abstract strategic vision, not the political calculation, but the specific tactical reality underneath it. The Fremen were not a population to be protected. They were a force to be reckoned with, a force that had been reckoning with itself for centuries, sharpening itself on the hardest conditions the planet could produce, and waiting, perhaps without knowing it was waiting, for a convergence that would give all of that accumulated capability somewhere to go. I also began to see the depth of what had been done to them. The occupation had not merely extracted resources and maintained order. It had been systematic. Deliberate restrictions on their population concentrations, calculated controls on their access to water technology, the kind of accumulated humiliation that is designed not just to suppress, but to break the self-perception of a people across generations. They had not broken. That was the thing that deserved to be said plainly, and often, and without qualification. Faced with every tool that a sophisticated imperial power could bring to bear on making them believe they were less than what they were, they had not broken. They had gone deeper into the desert instead, and become something that the powers that oppressed them could not follow. Paul was alive. I learned that in the 3rd week. He had escaped the fall with his mother. They had gone into the desert and been found by a different Fremen group, and through a series of events I pieced together only later, he had been accepted into their company and had been, by all accounts, doing what Paul Atreides did with every difficult environment he encountered, adapting faster than should have been possible. The visions he had been having, those half-seen futures that had been troubling him since the journey began, they were intensifying out there, in the deep desert. Something in the planet's chemistry, something in the spice that saturated everything on its surface, was doing something to his mind. Something that the Fremen had a word for, and the rest of the galaxy lacked the framework to understand. When I finally saw him again, he was not the boy I had been pushing through sparring drills on the landing deck. He was still 17, but he stood differently. He breathed differently. There was a quality of attention in him that had not been there before, a watchfulness that looked not outward but slightly ahead, as if he were listening to a frequency the rest of us could not quite hear. His mother looked at him the way you look at something you recognize but have never seen in that particular form before. Proud, uncertain, a little afraid. He embraced me and I did not have words for what I felt. I said, I was not there. He said, I know, I also know why. I did not ask him to explain that. Some things you accept. He asked me about the men. I told him the count. He asked me their names, all of them, those who had survived and those who had not, and he listened to each name with a stillness that I recognized from his sparring sessions, the complete attention he brought to things that mattered. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment. Then he said he was sorry, not for form. He meant it specifically for each of them. I told him his father had believed in the alliance with the desert people. I told him what Leto had said the night before we left our homeworld. Paul listened to that too. Then he said, I know. He'd been building toward it since before I understood what he was building. I said he was right about it. Paul nodded slowly. He said, The question is whether we can make it worth what it's already cost. I had no answer for that. It was not, I understood, actually a question. It was what he was carrying. He had changed in ways beyond the visions. He had always been observant. Lady Jessica had trained that into him along with everything else. But now the observation had a quality of patience attached to it that I associated with men twice his age. Men who had been through enough to know that most situations reveal themselves if you wait long enough and pay close enough attention. He did not hurry conversations. He did not fill silence with words when silence was the more honest response. He had learned, somewhere in those desert months, to treat the moment he was in as sufficient, to not be perpetually leaning forward into what came next, which is a thing that youth does almost universally, and that experience corrects, if the person is lucky enough to survive long enough for experience to do its work. He told me once that the Fremen had a practice they called the memory of water, a meditative discipline in which you held in your mind the precise image of water as you had last seen it, in every sensory detail, and you stayed with that image until the longing for it became bearable. Not comfortable, not absent, bearable. He said it was the most useful thing he had been taught since his mother started his training, because it was the only discipline he had encountered that did not promise to eliminate the difficult thing, but only to make living alongside it possible. He had adapted it, he said, for other kinds of longing. I did not ask him to specify. I understood well enough. The plan that took shape over the following months was not born from inspiration. It was ground out of the intersection of necessity and resource, debated in fire-lit caves while the desert howled outside, argued over by men and women who had different ideas about what was possible and what was permitted. The Fremen did not operate by command hierarchy in the way I was accustomed to. Their decision structures were lateral, distributed, built on demonstrated competence rather than inherited rank. This was initially maddening to me, and ultimately, I came to think, probably more functional than what I had spent my career inside. Paul moved through those debates the way water moves through stone, not by force, but by finding the path. He did not impose. He suggested, and listened, and waited, and suggested again. He learned their language completely, and then learned the deeper language underneath the words, the one that lives in gesture and silence, and the specific way a Fremen elder pauses before answering a question. He trained with their fighters and was honest when he fell short, and did not pretend that his mother's conditioning made him their equal in the deep desert. He asked questions without embarrassment. He showed the dead the kind of attention the living often fail to. The Fremen watched all of this, and they made their judgments. I will not tell you they accepted him fully or quickly or without conditions. That would be a lie. There were those who never accepted him, who viewed the entire arrangement with a suspicion that was entirely reasonable given their history with outsiders. There was a formal challenge, a duel in their custom with bladed weapons, mortal stakes. A warrior named Jamis called it. He was experienced, proven, a man the community respected. He had lost people to the occupiers and to the outsiders before the occupiers, and his distrust of anyone from beyond the desert was not irrational. It was earned through specific experience. Paul faced the challenge. He said plainly in the assembled company that he did not want to fight the man. The chamber went quiet. That kind of honesty was not what anyone had expected, not from someone trained in the politics of noble houses, where weakness is performed and disguised but never simply admitted. The Fremen challenger had expected arrogance or fear. What he got was honesty, and he was too experienced a fighter to mistake honesty for weakness. He pressed the challenge anyway. Their custom required it once called. I was not permitted to advise. I stood and watched. Paul fought with the desert blade techniques he had been learning, blended with the foundation I had built in him over years. He was not yet the equal of a lifelong Fremen fighter in that specific mode, and he knew it. What he had instead was adaptability, the ability to read an opponent mid-exchange and adjust faster than the opponent could account for. He had always had this. The desert had sharpened it into something else. He won, but not cleanly. He took a cut along his left side that I would have to help close afterward. He stood over Jami's when it was done, and the expression on his face was the one I mentioned earlier. The expression of someone who has just understood that winning has a cost that doesn't get lighter with practice. He went to one knee beside the man and said something in the Fremen dialect that I was not close enough to hear. Then he stood, and a girl who had been watching from across the chamber, young, with eyes the deep blue of desert-born people, a girl who had appeared in the visions he had described to me, she crossed to him and held out a blade. Her family's blade. She offered it as an act of what I can only describe as acknowledgement, not approval exactly, but a recognition of something that had just been established. He accepted it with both hands, which was the correct gesture, and bowed his head, which was not required but was the right thing to do. I think that moment cost him something permanent. Good. Permanence means you carry it, and carrying it means you don't make the same mistake twice. The mistake being, thinking that what you're capable of and what it requires of you are separable things. Meanwhile, I had my own work to do. The surviving Atreides soldiers were fewer than 30 now, but they had been through months of Fremen instruction and desert survival, and the particular grinding education of an environment that does not accept excuses. They were different men than they had been. Quieter, more patient, more dangerous in a way that was harder to see until it was too late to matter. I had been drilling them in the integration of their existing skills with what the Fremen had been teaching. How to apply conventional military weapons doctrine within the Fremen framework of environmental exploitation. How to move the way the desert moved. How to be the thing the enemy was not expecting, because the enemy was expecting something they recognized. I ran them hard, not because I was angry, though I was, not because I needed to prove something, though perhaps I did. I ran them hard because the job ahead was going to be hard, and the only honest preparation for hard work is harder work. A soldier who has been pushed further than he thought he could go and survived the pushing has learned something that cannot be taught any other way. He has learned where his actual floor is, which is almost always lower than the floor he believed in before the test. That knowledge is worth more than any specific technique. It is the foundation that techniques are built on. We ran integration drills with Fremen units 3 times a week through those months. Integration is the right word and the hard word. It is not enough to put 2 groups of capable fighters in the same space and expect coherence. Coherence requires a shared operational language, not necessarily the same words, but the same assumptions about what a hand signal means, how far a flanking element will push before waiting for confirmation, when a commander's authority supersedes established doctrine, and when established doctrine supersedes a commander's judgment in the heat of contact. These things are built, slowly, out of repetition and disagreement, and the occasional sharp failure that teaches more than any success. There was friction. I would be dishonest if I said otherwise. My people had been trained in methods that emphasized coordinated unit maneuver, clearly defined roles, hierarchical communication. The Fremen operated with a fluidity that looked, to eyes trained in the conventional way, like chaos, but was in fact something more sophisticated. Distributed decision-making by individuals of extremely high individual competence, each of whom had internalized the group's objective well enough to make locally optimal decisions without waiting for instruction. These were not incompatible systems. Getting them to work together required identifying the specific points of interface and building procedure around those points, while leaving everything else to the native competence on each side. The Fremen senior fighter assigned to our joint drills, a woman named Shadow, who had more kills to her record than anyone in my force including me, and who communicated this fact through posture and silence rather than any explicit claim. She watched the early friction with the patience of someone who has spent a lifetime waiting for outsiders to understand things she already knows. When I finally came to her and asked what we were doing wrong, she did not answer immediately. She made me watch a subsequent drill first. Then she said, in her accented but precise version of the common tongue, "Your men are waiting to be told what they already know. That is the habit. The habit is the problem." She was right. I spent the next 2 weeks drilling specifically on that, on the decomposition of the wait for orders reflex in situations where the information needed to act was already present. It is harder to undo than it sounds. 20 years of conditioning does not dissolve in 2 weeks, but it's softened enough to matter. The attacking forces and their patrons had made an assumption. It was a reasonable assumption, based on all available evidence. They had assumed that the desert would finish the job that the night assault had not. They had assumed that an exiled house's remnant, stripped of its infrastructure and its political backing and its ability to resupply, would dissolve within months. They had assumed that the Fremen would remain what they had always been, a localized nuisance, capable of harassment but not of strategic threat, to be managed rather than feared. They were wrong about all of it, but they would not know they were wrong until we showed them. The extraction facilities were the target. The massive crawler machines, the processing stations, the distribution infrastructure that turned raw desert into interstellar commerce. Destroy the infrastructure and you destroy the economic argument for the occupation. Destroy the economic argument and the political justification becomes untenable. This was not my strategic analysis. It was what the Fremen had known for decades. They had been conducting exactly this kind of attrition for years, limited in scale by their isolation. What Paul and his mother brought, what the Atreides remnant brought, was not the strategy. It was the specific technical and organizational capability to execute the strategy at a scale that could not be ignored. We also had something else, something the enemy had not anticipated. Paul and Lady Jessica had been deep in the desert for months, and the spice that saturated every breath of desert air, every particle of food, every cell of the great worm culture that was the planet's hidden architecture. That spice was doing to them what it had done to the Fremen over generations, but faster because of what they already were. Jessica had become something that the Fremen recognized from their oldest stories, a figure of such mental capability and control that they had given her a title and a place in their religious framework that was entirely outside anything I could have predicted. Paul was becoming something that their stories described and that I had no name for in my own framework. He was seeing further, clearer. The cost of that clarity was visible in his face if you knew what you were looking at, a permanent narrowing, a quality of weight that should not have been present in someone 17 years old. I asked him once at the edge of a fire-like conversation whether it hurt, the seeing. He was quiet for a while, then he said, "It's not that it hurts, it's that you can't unknow it. You see what's coming and you know that getting there will cost something, and then it costs exactly what you thought it would cost, and then you see what comes after that and it costs that too. You can't grieve each thing in sequence. You have to carry all of it at once." I said, "That's soldiering." He looked at me and almost smiled. He said, "Yes, I suppose it is." I asked him if he was afraid. He thought about it carefully the way he thought about everything now. He said, "I'm afraid of the paths that don't cost anything. The ones that look easy. Those are the ones where you've stopped asking the right questions." He paused. Then, "The costly path is at least honest." I did not have a response to that. I sat with it instead. The morning we launched the operation, the desert was as quiet as it ever gets, which is to say, not quiet at all, because the wind never stops and the sand never stops, and somewhere beneath the surface, the great worms were moving through their ancient patterns. But the particular quality of quiet that exists when a large number of very capable people are moving with absolute intentionality toward a single objective, that quiet was present. I have felt it before in other places with other men. It is the most focused silence I know. The Fremen moved first. They had been moving for days, actually, positioning, pre-staging, establishing the geometric relationships between themselves and the targets and the natural features of the terrain that would determine the shape of the engagement. This is what they meant by fighting the desert. The desert was not the backdrop. It was the weapon, and deploying the weapon required preparation that began long before the first exchange of fire. They moved through the erg in the patterns that left no compacted surface, the rolling walk they had taught us, weight distributed and shifted so as not to create the rhythmic vibration that drew the worms. In groups of 4 and 6, separated by enough distance to appear, to any monitoring system, as random desert movement. They had been doing this for generations. The enemy's surveillance assets were calibrated to detect organized military movement. Organized Fremen movement and random sand drift looked, to those assets, almost identical. My people came in from the eastern approach, using the rock formations to mask our thermal signatures. The processing station we were tasked with was a secondary facility, not the largest, but positioned such that its destruction would compromise the primary facility's ability to export product. We had studied its layout, its security patterns, its crew rotation schedule. We had studied it the way the Fremen studied the sandworms, not with admiration, but with the specific intent of exploiting every vulnerability we could identify. What the enemy did not know was that the great worms could be ridden. I had seen Paul do it once before the operation, in a demonstration that was simultaneously the most terrifying and the most extraordinary thing I had witnessed in 22 years of watching extraordinary things. The Fremen had a method, tools, technique, knowledge accumulated across hundreds of years, for mounting the creatures and steering them across the desert at speeds that no vehicle could match, and that left no technological signature to track. It required the complete suppression of any behavior the worm would interpret as vulnerability. It required treating a creature the size of a warship as a mount. The Fremen boys learned this as adolescents. Paul had learned it in months, and the learning had been, from what I was told by those who had observed it, an exercise in the kind of determined, methodical courage that is different from recklessness because it is deliberate. You look at the thing that can kill you without effort. You understand exactly how it can kill you and what it would feel like, and then you do the thing anyway because the goal requires it. That is not fearlessness. That is the decision that fear does not get to make the final call. When the signal came and the worms crested the dunes at the primary facility, not one, not two, but a column of them, ridden by Fremen fighters in full desert kit with weapons hot, the reaction of the enemy forces was exactly what we had predicted and hoped for. They had contingency plans for armed ground assault. They had contingency plans for air attack. They had no contingency plan for this. Their tactical systems categorized the worms as environmental hazard rather than force element, which meant their suppressive fire protocols were not activating correctly, which meant the Fremen riders were inside their perimeter before the targeting solutions resolved. We hit the secondary facility at the same moment, coordinated by the signal we had prearranged, and the element of surprise is not a small thing when you have prepared for it carefully. The security detail was good. They were not the conditioned warrior caste. Those were massed at the primary site, but they were professional, and they responded with speed and discipline. We did not try to fight them in the facility. We had not planned to fight them in the facility. We had planned to use the facility's own structure against them, the same way the Fremen used the desert. Choke points, sightlines, the acoustic properties of processing equipment that turns a whisper into confusion and a shout into disorientation. We passed through their defensive formation like water through stone. 3 of my men took wounds in that passage, none fatal. I had a cut across my right hand from a blade I hadn't tracked quickly enough, which was embarrassing, and I noted it and moved on. The first explosion was the coolant conduit on the east side of the processing deck. The second was the pressure system in the extraction chamber. The 3rd through 7th were placed at intervals I will not describe in detail, because the specifics are less important than the principle. We did not destroy the facility randomly. We destroyed it deliberately, in a sequence designed to cascade, each failure inducing the next. the whole structure consuming itself in an order that we had mapped out in a sand drawing on the floor of a Fremen cave 2 weeks earlier. The men who had done the mapping were engineers, repurposed from their original role as facility analysts for a house that no longer existed. They had taken that repurposing without complaint and had done the work with the kind of precision that reflects genuine expertise. When the sequence completed and the facility began its terminal structural failure, it did so almost exactly as they had predicted. I made a note to tell them that, if we survived, we were clear of the facility before the main sequence completed. The primary site was a different story. The condensed warrior forces were there, and they fought the way they always fought, which is to say, without hesitation and with the suppression of the pain response that made them so difficult in conventional engagements. But the desert does not care about the suppression of pain response. The sandworms do not care about tactical doctrine. The Fremen riders were fighting from elevated positions on the backs of creatures that could not be shot or explosively neutralized in any time frame that mattered, and the ground fighters coordinating below them were using every terrain feature, every acoustic advantage, every granule of 10,000 years of accumulated environmental knowledge. I watched some of it from a rise to the north, coordinating the secondary element and monitoring the primary engagement through the optical systems we had salvaged from the wreckage of the original posting. What I saw was not warfare in the sense I had been trained to understand. It was more like weather. The enemy forces were the solid thing and the Fremen and their desert were the weather, and weather does not negotiate. Weather does not tire. Weather does not have a chain of command you can disrupt or a supply line you can cut. Weather simply is and continues, and the solid thing either endures or it does not. It did not endure. I will not make it sound cleaner than it was. Men died on both sides. Some of my own people, men I had trained, men I had slept beside in the desert, men whose names I could recite at this moment and may not, for the sake of the weight, they did not walk away from that morning. The cost was not abstract. It never is, and anyone who tells you otherwise is lying or has not seen it close enough. What I will tell you is this. When the dust settled and the silence came, and the desert silence after violence has a specific quality, a hell-breath quality, a quality of the landscape reasserting its own permanence over the temporary noise of human conflict, the extraction facilities were destroyed. The occupation infrastructure was compromised beyond near-term repair. And the forces that had swept through our city in a single night, that had seemed so absolute in their capability, were learning what every occupying power that came to that desert had eventually learned. You do not control this place. You endure it, or you leave. Paul stood in the aftermath on the ridge above the primary site. His mother stood beside him. I positioned myself a few steps back, as I had been trained to position myself, close enough to reach, far enough to not impose. He was looking out at the desert, not at the burning facility, not at the evidence of what we had done, but at the horizon, at the place where the sand met the sky in that particular late-morning haze that turns distance into water. He had the look of a man checking a calculation against a result. I said, "We did it." He turned to look at me. His eyes were deeply blue now, not the pale blue of the genetic trait he had been born with, but the solid, saturated blue that the spice did to a person after long exposure. His mother's eyes had done the same. It was striking and slightly unnerving, the way most evidence of real transformation is. He said, "We did the first part of it." I understood what he meant. The occupation was damaged, not ended. The imperial political structure that had permitted all of this, that had sanctioned the transfer of power, turned its gaze away from what the occupying house had done to the desert people over decades, used those brutal warrior forces as a hidden instrument. That structure was intact. It would send replacements. It would recalculate its approach. It would continue, unless forced to confront what it had created. That confrontation was going to take longer. It was going to cost more. I knew this. I believed he knew it with a precision that I did not have access to, a precision that lived in whatever the desert and the spice had opened in him. I said, "Then we do the next part." He nodded just once, then he turned back to the horizon. The Fremen were already moving by then, policing the field, recovering what could be recovered, performing the rites their culture required for those lost, letting the desert take the rest. They moved with the same absolute economy they brought to everything. Not because they were unfeeling, I had seen enough of their grief to know they felt it fully, but because the desert demanded efficiency in all things, including mourning. You honored the dead, and then you continued, because stopping was something the desert did not permit. I had one of my surviving men count heads, 21 of the original 32, plus the Fremen losses, which they counted in their own way and which were not mine to number. 21. I went through each name in my mind, the 11 absent ones, and then I put the wall back up, and I shouldered my equipment, and I began to walk. The planet was not free, not yet, but it was no longer simply occupied. There is a difference. The difference is not comfort. The math of suffering is not transformed by momentum. But there is a difference between a people who can only absorb what is done to them and a people who have demonstrated to themselves and to their adversaries that they are capable of something else. That demonstration matters. It changes the calculation on both sides. It changes what the occupier has to commit, and for how long and at what cost. It changes what the occupied can imagine. The desert people had always known they were capable. They had known it in their bones and in their water discipline, and in the way they rode the great worms, and in the 10,000 specific competencies they had built across generations of surviving the unsurvivable. What they had lacked was scale, and organization, and the specific technical integration that my people had spent their careers developing, and someone who could speak both languages, theirs and the Empire's, well enough to build the bridge. Paul was that bridge. His mother was part of it. The Atreides remnant, filed down to its essential edge by the months of desert survival, was part of it. And the Fremen themselves were most of it. They always had been. They had just been waiting, without knowing they were waiting, for the conditions to converge. I have been asked whether I think it was worth it. Whether the years that followed, the continued struggle, the ongoing cost, the things that Paul became and the price he paid for becoming them, were worth what was achieved. I do not answer that question. It is not a question I am equipped to answer, and I distrust anyone who answers it quickly. The scale of human events is not something any one person can hold in their hands and weigh cleanly. What I can tell you is what I saw, and what it was to be part of it. I saw men who had lost everything find out what they were made of when everything was gone. I saw a people that an empire had spent decades trying to erase become the thing that empire could not figure out how to erase. I saw a boy carry the weight of what he could see coming and keep walking anyway. And I know how heavy that kind of weight is even for men who have had decades to get used to it. I saw the desert, patient as geology, outlast every plan that did not take it seriously. I saw a duke die in the service of an idea that was bigger than his house. And I saw that idea outlive him, which is the only kind of immortality that means anything to those of us who do not believe in the other kinds. I saw what humans are, when you strip away the infrastructure and the political protection and the supply lines and the safety margins, and leave them with nothing but each other, and the knowledge they have built into their hands and their minds. What you find, underneath all of that, underneath the comfort and the convenience and the institutional belonging that we mistake for strength because it is large and familiar, what you find underneath is something the galaxy keeps underestimating. We are adaptable in ways that are not fully legible from the outside. We are stubborn in ways that look, to a sufficiently foreign observer, like irrationality. We form bonds with each other and with places, and with ideas that drive behavior that cannot be modeled purely in terms of self-interest. We find, in the worst situations, a kind of dark humor that is not denial but is instead a refusal to let the worst situation have the last word. The people who destroyed House Atreides were optimized. They were the product of centuries of deliberate engineering toward a specific kind of lethality. They were, in their domain, nearly perfect. They had not been optimized for a desert that would not cooperate. They had not been optimized for an enemy that treated losing everything as a starting condition rather than a terminal one. They had not been engineered for the specific human capacity to take what remains after catastrophic loss and build something from it that is harder and stranger and more dangerous than what existed before. That capacity is not a superpower. It is not unique to any house or nation or fighting tradition. It is the most common thing in the human inventory. It shows up, reliably, everywhere that humans are pushed far enough. We do not know, most of us, that we have it until we have it. And that is perhaps the most honest thing I can tell you about what happened on that desert world. We did not know what we were. The desert showed us. When I walk into any room now, any building, any structure, any shelter with walls and a ceiling and climate control, some part of me checks it the way the desert taught me to check everything. Exits, sightlines, load-bearing features, what the terrain gives you and what it takes away. The desert does not leave you when you leave the desert. That is either a loss or a gift, depending on the day. Most days, I have made my peace with it. Most days, when I see young men preparing for things they do not yet understand the weight of, I think of the Duke and his gamble, and the boy on the sparring deck who blocked a combination he had only seen once, and the girl with the deep blue eyes who offered a blade as acknowledgement when she could have offered nothing. I think of 21 men walking away from a burning facility in the early morning on a world that had killed better men than us, and found us insufficiently interesting to finish. I think of the desert, still out there, patient and enormous and indifferent, filled with creatures that eat anything foolish enough to make the wrong kind of noise, and the people who live inside all of that and call it home. And I think we were part of that once. We were part of something that did not accept what it was told it was. That is enough. That is more than enough.